Very careful about drawing causal conclusions from a little bit of data. And I'm going to repeat this many, many times, but it's worth repeating many times. Do not conflate the what with the why. The what is, there's a difference in time to promotion between men and women. That's a what, but that doesn't tell me why. And so often in our data, we have what's. And we think that we know the why once we have the what. Bad idea. That's first. Second, just because we can run a correlation, or just because we can find two things that seem to change at the same rate or in concert with each other, doesn't mean that we've actually found any kind of real relationship. Never mind not a causal relationship, we may not have any relationship at all. Because one of the things that matters, in addition to the data, the research, the statistics being significant, is whether they're meaningful. Do your results mean anything? Right here, in the case of this client, the statistics, it was not a statistically significant difference, but oh, was it a meaningful one? A very meaningful one, especially because they don't promote that many times a year. So promotion cycle was quite a large difference. When you've got a large difference that's almost significant, that's something to pay attention to. And whether it's significant, not significant, that's just a flag. And whether something is significant is actually a convention, right? I mean, this has to do with statistics, type 1 errors, don't have time to get into that. But let us say that whether something is statistically significant or not is actually just a convention. Something that we all agree upon. And what are comfortable odds for perhaps having a false positive or a false negative? Those are conventions that we use in different fields of different conventions. So when people tell you it's statistically significant, just remember, all they're doing is hewing to convention. One of the things that I consult on a lot as a human capital consultant is, how do we hire? Right? So this is something I'm going to go back to a couple different times. But one of them is the question of using personality or strengths-based assessments in hiring. Let me give you some very important advice on using strength-based assessments for hiring and personality assessments for hiring. Don't. We'll get to why later. But that will be my preliminary advice. Just don't. There are plenty of other ways that you can assess candidates, but strengths and personality are not included. Because any personality combination can do any job, any strength set can do any job. We'll come back to that. But the most important thing is, once again, don't confound the what and the why. Right? And that, by the way, is why people use personality tests in hiring, is that they find that they use personality tests in hiring and they find that they get predictive results. Those predictive results are a what, not a why. We'll see this in prediction. Sometimes do people show me like, well, we have data. And then I say, okay, show me how you got the data. They show me how they got the data. I'm like, you have nothing. And they're like, but we have, and you know, true story that I was actually at a conference where I'm not going to embarrass the multinational consulting firm that gave this presentation, but I rendered their entire 2-year study completely invalid in 2 simple questions. And for the record, it happens I'm the person they called on. There were about 17 hands up in that room, and I'm guessing at least 5 of those people had the exact same questions because they were pretty basic. But they made some fundamental errors in how they got their data, one of them being that they took a validated survey, grabbed a few questions, and didn't check for convergent validity. You can't just pick and choose questions off a validated survey and pretend that that's the same or the equivalent or even a correlate of the actual full survey. You have to prove that with the statistics. Oops! That's a big oops, but that means that all the data they collected, tens of thousands of people over 2 years, and they've got nothing. Unless they can prove, they'll have to do another study. Right? They'll have to prove that what they did was valid. But if they end up doing an additional study to prove that, and they prove that that pick and choose little survey they have is not a valid representation of the original survey, it's all dead. All of it. 10,000 plus data points, 2 years of work, and it amounts to this. Garbage in, garbage out. So spend time on that. One of the things that we even don't know about data is how true our findings are. Have we found, what level of truth have we found? Have we found one of the grand truths of the universe? Or have we found a local truth? In a lot of cases, we like to put labels on things, right? We want to say, we use things like discrimination, right? What is discrimination? That's something very particular. There are a lot of things that could be going on that may or may not be discrimination. We talk about things like irresponsible, another word that's got a lot of possible meanings, or can be scoped in very narrowly, and then you're misapplying things. One of my favorites is actually like positive experience, which incidentally is very much subject to cultural differences. What is your idea of a good time? If you stop and think about it, what culture you belong to, what culture you grew up with is very much going to affect your idea of a good time. Right? So if I have you do something and I say, you know, did you have a good time? And I'm not at least accounting somewhere in my data for your cultural background, I just wasted my time. I have no idea if what I found is actually valid. Now, at the same time, then you go to the other extreme. Well, we can't possibly cover every angle of a single variable, and I can't possibly cover every single culture out there, right? And by the way, we love making nice gross generalizations. For example, Asian culture or black culture. I've heard both of these terms. I have no idea what either one of them means. Especially, I mean, like there's American black culture, there's Caribbean black culture, there's African black culture, and each of those breaks down again. And people from Cambodia, are you going to tell me they're similar to people in Japan? How similar exactly is that? Is that similar enough that I can squash that under one group and call it Asian? Or sometimes I've even seen like Asian/Pacific Islander. Oh boy. Or Asian. Some people even include Southeast Asian under Asian. And so, we're comparing folks from India to folks from Japan. Okay. And again, once you're doing that, I start to have questions. That said, just because you've got something that is of limited validity, that doesn't mean you just throw it all out because it's got limited validity. You respect the limitations. Right? If what you did was you just lumped all Asians, for example, into one group, okay, you did that. That may not have been the best idea. It depends on what you're up against, depends on your constraints. There are a lot of reasons to, not to. All you need to do is you need to respect the fact that you have an overgeneralization in there. Respect that is a limitation of your data. Funny thing, like when you see research published in the New York Times, or media, all those stuff, they talk about this. You know what they never talk about? Almost never, anyway. The limitations of the study. As scientists, one of the sections of the paper, of every scientific study that's out there, is limitations and future directions. We all discuss in our papers what the limitations of our studies are. You notice that those don't usually get covered. They're not in the abstract, almost never in the abstract. They come late in the paper, so people don't see this part. People don't see that although we've got some great conclusions, we have to discuss that. We may not have checked enough cross-cultural validity. There may have been some problems here. Our sample size might have been small. Any number of other things that may have limited our data. Did we measure what we said we were going to measure? Now remember, if we use a measure of personality, well, what's personality anyway? Never mind, that's a long discussion, right? But the thing is, even if we could come up with a clear definition of personality, which many people can, but even if you can, how does that apply in the workplace? Is that your workplace persona? Do we have a workplace persona? Is there only a subset of our personality that we exhibit in the workplace? If I test your general personality, what you're like as a general person, does that mean that that's how you are at work? I mean, I love, as a college professor, B-school professor, I ask my students, do you think I'm an introvert or an extrovert? What do you guys think? How many people think introvert? How many of you think extrovert? How many of you, I mean, I am excluding ambivert, which I actually am, but funny thing is, think about how you drew that conclusion, right? You've never met me, you've never really talked to me, you've never seen me at a party. All you know is that I can get up in front of a group of people and talk in an animated voice and wave my hands around. From this, you know nothing. There are lots of introverts that get up and do that. Lots of actors, actresses that are introverted. Lots of introverted people can get up on stage and talk in front of people. So far, you don't know anything about me, actually, other than like what I do for a living, and I've got some background in this stuff, right? But people jump to this conclusion all the time, and students are shocked to discover that at a party, I'm like that guy in the corner, talking to one person. I'm not the life of the party. I don't really like parties, and I don't go to them very often because I'm actually quite a shy person. People don't believe it. There's a big difference between standing up in front of a group of people and actually opening yourself up in a one-on-one conversation. I'm a lot more shy than people think, but that's the whole point. If you measure my personality, am I shy at work? Am I shy at a party? At work, I'm a lot less shy. I'm much more talkative at work. I'm much more talkative one-on-one, but you put me in a group full of people and you'll be like, people show different things in different contexts. Personality tests don't always test for context. Your work context, what's that going to be like? We don't think about that. In all cases, when we make a measurement, we need to ask ourselves, do we measure what we say we're going to measure? We don't want to get too general. We don't want to get too specific. We need to think very carefully about exactly what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, why we're measuring it, and whether what we measure is actually what we're measuring. Right? I will give you several examples, but one of them is positive experience, right? We talk about whether people are happy. You ever look at all those? Or actually, this has got to be one of my favorites. This is a great joke among organizational behavior researchers and folks like that. Employee engagement. How many of you have heard about employee engagement before? Right, measuring this one, and right, even customer engagement, right? Engagement with the product. What does engagement? You're all product managers, right? What does engagement with the product mean? Right? Are you measuring what you say you're measuring? People say like, or can people get engaged while they do this? I don't know, are rings coming out also? I mean, diamonds or emeralds or I suppose if a product is forever, I guess a diamond could be forever and vice versa. I don't know. All right, so you know what? One of the other things we ask is face validity. Now, you all know what creative means, right? People who think. How many of you heard the term "think outside the box"? I hate that expression. I'm a creativity researcher. I hate that expression. Hate it, hate it, hate it. I have a whole essay on why if you poke around my website. But let me tell you know where the origin of this is. Think outside the box. It's this. The famous 9-dot problem. Link all 9 dots using 4 straight lines of fewer without lifting the pen, without tracing the same line more than once. And the hint is to solve this, you have to think outside the box. Now I got a question for you. I don't call it, do you think that's creative? Because I don't think that's creative. Right? Whoa, you colored outside the lines a little bit. And that's getting daring. Now maybe in the workplace that might be a very, very strong act of daring, but I question whether daring is the same as creative. Daring, I mean, necessary but not sufficient to be a little bit daring. But okay, so you colored outside the lines a little bit. You're still fixated on the box. This is still box-oriented thinking. Now, if you really want to be creative, in my opinion, and you look at the research on this, forget the box. Let's do this with one line. Here's 3 different ways to do that. Never said how big the pen or the marker or whatever has to be. So what if I take a huge one and just draw it across all line? There we go. Right? The left is Euclidean space versus non-Euclidean space. This one's a little bit geeky here, but in a non-Euclidean space, maybe they're all just on the same line. Or maybe I can just arrange them in a plane. Right? On this circle here. Yeah, throwing away assumptions. I didn't say, there are a lot of things that I didn't stipulate, and yet you assumed them. Well, thinking outside the box, or I should say transcending the box, or boxless thinking. You're going beyond the box. That's all that creative. To do personality testing for hiring, here's why that's a problem. Right? If you stop and think about it, any personality, think about the different combinations of personality you've seen. Can you really come up with one that can't do a particular job? Of strengths that you can come up with that wouldn't be suited to a particular job? Look at the speed of the job, look at the nature of the job, see if there are ways to speed it up, slow it down, do it with one hand, do it with 2 hands, right? There's so many different ways that you can shift around the task, right? So maybe a creative person might be the best person for that because they're the ones that don't get caught up in the monotony. No matter how you paint this picture, you can always come up with an alternative, right? The most common one I hear is, introverts can't be salespeople. First, I personally beg to differ from my own sample size of 1 experience. I can most certainly be a salesperson, and I've done it quite well, thank you very much. That doesn't mean, however, that I enjoy it. You can be good at things you don't enjoy. I love sales, I had a good time with it, but then, I discovered, no, I don't really love sales. I thought I loved sales. I don't. But you don't need personality in hiring. But then people say but we do personality in hiring, and it predicts something, right? We run our model, and it's got predictive validity, and that's statistically significant. I hate to break this to people, but a regression, which is what you use for predictive validity, is a correlation. It's a set of correlations. It's still not causative. You still, at the end of the day, need some kind of theory, right? But here's the real kicker. What you compare personality against most of the time when you run this is a measure of personality to predict job success better than using nothing? I would imagine that anything's better than nothing. But, I mean, really, we're not testing is personality a good measure. That's the kicker. It's not a good measure. You're not testing it against other measures most of the time. And most of the time when you want to test it against other measures, you need one hell of a sample size for that. Personality may be better than nothing, but even then, I think that's somewhat misleading. Because once again, just because you can make the numbers work out, doesn't mean that the theory supports it. Theoretically makes sense. Like when you stop and think about this point about personality, strengths, all these things, when you really stop and think about it, it doesn't make sense. It's really more about the culture of your workplace. Do you fit the culture of the workplace, not the tasks of the job? But far too often, what happens is they test the people that are successful in the job, and then they say, well, if these people are successful in the job, then people just like them will be successful in the job. What are you, building a clone army? And that's what you get a lot of the time. We get clones. And you get a lack of diversity. And remember, diversity is often, but not always. This is another one of those like challenges we make. Diversity is not always a good thing. It is often a good thing. There's great value in diversity. It all depends on how you define diversity, right? Right? You ask people to define diversity, and you get some very limited answers. But how about diversity of thought? Yeah, when you're doing stuff like this, you don't get diversity of thought. You get all the same people. Now, by the way, there are times when you need many of the same people because you also need to reach consensus. Remember that you need diversity of opinions, but at the end of the day, you need to reach consensus. And if you have too much diversity, everybody's pulling against each other. Everybody's got their own idea. Everybody's got their own thought. You can't come to agreement. Oh, well. And then we've got one of the biggest problems of all in data, which is generalizability or external validity. Right? How many of you would feel as good as you do about the research about the workplace if you knew that the participants were college students or MBA students? But you'd be surprised to discover how many times those studies are about college students. So the participants were college students or MBA students. There's a famous study done on interviewing, but it was done with people who did not have much work experience or much interviewing experience. No, I'm not saying they may not have some interesting conclusions to look at later. They very well might. Those might be really interesting conclusions. And it may be a phenomenon that is really worth studying. But when you run this study on college students or MBA students, even ones that have 3, 4 years, 5 years of work experience, that is not the same as running a study on somebody who's been a manager for 10 years. That's a really different ballgame. Or somebody who's done 30, 40, 50 interviews in their time. Or has managed a few dozen people in their time. That's a very different sample. Now, are the conclusions that we draw about MBA students, college students, and so on the same? Can we extend from there to experienced managers? I'm not sure about that. I don't know about that. And yet, once again, that doesn't mean we throw it all away. Right? The point of statistical significance, the data, all these things, they tell us what to pay attention to. Right? It doesn't mean we accept it without question. And it doesn't mean that if it isn't quite valid that we just throw it away without question. Most of these things are guidelines. Or as my statistics professor, who happens to be Ted Cross, I learned a great deal from him in my undergrad years. But one of the points was, is it meaningful? But then also, statistics is both art and science. And one of the arts is, what are the data telling us? Look at the data, eyeball the data, go deep in the data, and don't just look at the surface statistics. But also look at the theory and sometimes just what makes sense and what we can actually defend as theory. Now, in many cases, when we're assessing people, and as product managers, you've got to assess people a lot. You have to work with people. You've got to find out what your customer's like. Well, you got to think about how your customers might respond. And far too often, when we interact with customers, when we interact with participants, we can see a lot of different problems. One of them is that, we have the people put like, you give them a 7-point Likert scale and they give you a 1 or a 7, a 1 or a 7, a 1 or a 7, a 1 or a 7. Or they really don't want to commit to anything, so they can just give you a neutral pattern all down the middle. Either way, bad data. That's a problem. One is, when you're doing, let's say, a more in-depth interview, right? Especially when you're doing think-alouds with them, you have to ask yourself, to what extent are they just conforming to what I expect? To what extent am I expressing my opinions to them? At what point am I giving them subtle cues about what they're supposed to do? A number of experiments in the replicability crisis that's going on in a number of different fields, turns out that that has actually been a bit of a problem. Some indicators that the famous Stanford prison experiment had some of those problems, that the experimenter subtly, or in some cases, there are debates as to whether it was subtly, not so subtly, conveyed expectations. To what extent are expectations conveyed? And I mean, even in interaction with the participants, just basic interactions, is they may ask the experimenter a yes or no question, and the experimenter makes maybe too fast of a yes, or a very emphatic no, or a slow no, or they sort of waffle for a little bit before they go, well, I can't answer that. Right? All that's information. Right? And you have to wonder how much that information is affecting your results. How about if I do, let's say, a survey on racism? Now, who here would love to be labeled as a racist? Nobody, never mind. Right? Nobody wants to be labeled as a racist. So if I ask you something about racism and your responses to people that are not from your demographic or from a demographic that you may be somewhat biased against, to what extent are you really going to admit to that? Who's going to cop to that? Social desirability. Nobody wants to admit to these things, right? Now, what if you hold opinions that are, not, so to speak, what we call enlightened, or the enlightened opinions, or the proper opinions for this day and age, right? How many of you would openly admit to being a Republican right now if you were? How biased that question was? The real thing I slipped past you was I threw out a ridiculously biased question, and just in the way that I framed that question, I got you all thinking it's probably a bad thing to be a Republican, or to admit to being a Republican. See how subtle that can be? By the way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being a Republican. It's one of two political parties we have in this country. Oh, but here's what's really the problem. The thing is, and for the record, I'm a registered Republican, but just because I'm registered Republican doesn't mean I vote Republican. As a matter of fact, you have no idea how I voted. Really, people don't always vote along the party line. That's correlation. You're mixing up a what and a why. Right? I've heard people try to analyze who voted for Trump, who voted for Clinton, why they must have done that thing. You want to find out why somebody voted for Trump or Clinton? Ask them. Don't assume that that's what they did or why they did, or so you're saying you can tolerate this, or you think that this thing was okay for that other candidate or for this candidate or whatever. You know what? People have different reasons why they vote. Don't all vote for the same reason, and just because you think it works one way and a lot of people think it works one way and you can create yourself an echo chamber on social media does not mean that you understand how everybody works. Right? This happens a lot. People give responses catering to their audience. We cater to our audience all the time. Right? And we do it often without even thinking about it. So we have to worry about that. Language difficulty. I mean, in many cases, we try to get native English speakers, or natives of the language in which we're doing the test, or people that are fluent. What's fluent? Like, one of the things that's actually in my background, I'm fluent in Spanish. Right now, people listen to me. I speak with an accent. I'm fluent in the language. But somebody asked me last night if I could have a discussion about research in Spanish. No, I went to grad school in the United States. It's actually very hard. I don't know a lot of the technical research terms. There's a big difference between being a native speaker. The other difference, by the way, is the slang. I don't use a lot of Spanish slang. I use some, because I grew up speaking it, but not a lot. I didn't hear the slang so much. So in some cases, there'll be random words that I miss. It doesn't mean that I speak it perfectly or that I speak it like a native. It's the difference between native and fluent. And then, the difference between fluent and advanced and intermediate and basic, right? In all those cases, how do you differentiate those, right? Like, people think, so if I'm fluent in Spanish, I can write an entire research paper in Spanish. Probably not. I could probably read a newspaper, but I don't know that I could write a research paper or that I could discuss technical things. The same problem in a couple other languages I speak. These things are challenging, not to mention cultural experience. Right? I'll give you another one, right? How many of you have ever been to any of the countries in Asia that are south of China? So, the taxi cabs or tuk-tuks or any of the other modes of transportation, they were varying sizes, right? Now, how about if you ask a native of any of those countries, somebody who grew up there for most of their lives, then starts working in the U.S., how many M&Ms fit in the back of a taxi cab? It depends on what you think a taxi cab is, right? Out the window, you go to some New York street corner, start looking at taxi cabs. You notice they're not all the same size. What if you've never seen M&Ms before? Thinking like, who could not have seen M&Ms? You know what? There are a lot of countries where you don't find M&Ms on every street corner. I mean, just as one example, went to China for a while, stayed in China for about a month. You know how many times I saw M&Ms while I was in China? Not very often. Right? What do you work with? You're with. And while we're at it, about the words used, this is something that's come up several times. I want to get back to that for a second. How about the words that we use? What we can do is, we can use leading or loaded questions. And I love this one. How happy are you with HR's new policy? Be happy with it, right? And remember how I framed that whole Republican question? Who wants to admit to being a Republican? That was the trick. Admit to, right? How about if I said, okay, so how many Republicans do we have in this room? It's a very different question than who wants to admit to being a Republican. That was a loaded question. We wanted to find out. You got to ask it completely neutrally. How many Republicans are there in the room? By the way, that would have worked just as well if I said, who wants to admit to being a Democrat? I just want to point out to you, this is not, what's loaded is not the word Republican. What's loaded is the word admit to. I keep all the hands down as long as I'm saying admit to. Right? It's very easy, right? And then there are the ones that have a nice, implication, like what's the most expensive thing you've stolen from a store? This presumes you stole something. Right? Now, obviously, a logical answer is nothing, right? Nothing, because I never stole anything, right? I mean, when you stop and think about it, that's a logical answer, but that's not what's implied. Careful how we ask these questions, and I used obvious examples, but there are plenty of others. All define terms the same way. As a matter of fact, one of the funny things that often is a cross-cultural phenomenon is this thing called punctuality. In Singapore, that was like, Singaporeans, very punctual people. You have a meeting in Singapore, you better show up 5 minutes early, because that meeting is starting en punto, right on time. The question, and if you, the meeting starts at, 12, and you're there at 12:01, you're late. Countries where, the meeting starts at 12, and if you're there at 12:10, you're early. Depends, right? We all have these different concepts of time. So, it's interesting. But how about, vaguer terms like, I go to the store often. Let's think about how many times per week that must mean, right? If I say I go to the store often, how many times a week is that? Answer for yourself. How many of you said 1 or 2? 3 or 4? 5 or 6? 7 or 8? Anybody go above 7? Right, so some of you are saying I go more than once a day. You know what? Often is not more than once a day, or is it, right? So we're all going to debate this one, right? It's just as bad with rarely, right? We can talk about, some of the HR trends are a good thing. What's good? Your employee do a good job. How fun, believe it or not, right? Are you having a good day? Right? How many times somebody asks you, have you had a good day? And you're like, yes. You just don't want to get into this. Like, I've had a very complex day. I've thought about a whole lot of things today. There's been some really interesting things that have been going on. You don't want to give a 20-minute answer. So you're just like, yeah. Or then getting into, what do you mean by good? If I say vanilla ice cream, I want you to rank these things. Vanilla ice cream, chocolate ice cream, strawberry ice cream, right? Now then you say, you follow my preference and you say that chocolate is the best, and yes, I know there are some vanilla people out there, but, you do you. Right, so I say chocolate ice cream is the best, followed by vanilla, followed by strawberry. Right, okay, that's great. How much better is chocolate? You don't know how much better chocolate is than vanilla or strawberry. You want to know the really funniest thing of all? I don't need ice cream. So that whole thing is moot for me. But even still, I can still tell you that if I've got to eat, if you're forced feeding me ice cream, make it chocolate. Right, that's great, but you don't have the relative differences. Now again, that doesn't mean that your data are completely invalid. It just means that you have to respect the fact that all you know is the order, but not the magnitude. Again, respect the doubt. Respect what you have, respect what you don't have. Now here are 3 terms that I see thrown out a lot. That mindfulness. What is your working definition of this? Nice range on that. I did an article with Vera Lodewijk about the differences between mindfulness, flow, hypnosis. Mindfulness, for the record, has a very loaded history. There's a lot to mindfulness, including a cultural history that a lot of people just ignore. They start talking about mindfulness, they've westernized the concept, and they just completely ignore the fact that this comes from India, this comes from Hindu culture, Hinduism, Buddhism, Like, all these things are part of mindfulness. You can't just strip it of that and say, yeah, we're all mindful here. And by the way, most of the time when I ask people to define mindfulness, you know what they end up saying? It's basically paying attention. You just say paying attention instead of being mindful. These are different things, right? Again, partly because mindfulness is not an isolated construct. It actually, let's say psychic. That's another one of those, like, it must be psychic. I don't know, if you actually look into this, like, psychic means like a million different things, right? People love to throw it. But again, we throw words around, and we don't actually create working definitions. So, like, one of the things that, in science that we'll sometimes do, like, if we're talking about creativity, if I present a paper on creativity, one of the first things I will do in my earliest slides is I will provide my operating definition. This is how I define creativity. Whenever I use the word creativity in this talk, it means this. And that way, again, you respect my conclusions, what I'm actually talking about. The other thing is, sometimes we fire off words that don't really necessarily have such meaning. Again, try not, do or do not, there is no try, right? Well, so if there's no such thing as try, then, why do we have people in surveys that say try? Have you ever tried this? Have I ever done it? Have I ever tried? Did I try? Did I think about doing it? Did I sort of tentatively attempt it? Right? Like, what are you asking me here? Right? We have to think very carefully about the words that we use. And boy, oh boy, do we ever ask questions without context. Not just my kingdom for a horse, but my kingdom for a context. Right? If I asked you, what is your favorite TV show? It depends on what day of the week it is. Oh, and which TV shows you probably watched recently, and so many other items, right? It's not just, what's your favorite TV show? Right? How about if I asked you, what is the best TV show ever? Right? Who's going to be able to answer that one easily? Most people cannot, for any number of reasons. If for no other reason, then what do you like? Do you like to look at the acting? Do you like to look at the humor? Do you like to look at, which ones are more dramatic? What kind of day have you had? Right? All of the factors that get into what your favorite TV show is. How recently did you see it, right? I mean, if you've been, watching Star Trek TNG recently, you might stand out more in your mind as a favorite show, even though it hasn't been on the air in about 20 some odd years, right? Who knows? And what reasons do you have for liking a show, right? You might like a particular actor or actress in it, right? So then that's why you like it. That part's amazing. Or you love the plot. The acting stinks, but you really love the plot. Right? Things like that will very much affect what your responses are going to be and the context in which something is asked. Right? I mean, I've seen Likert scales with and without the neutral. And by the way, this is a raging debate in the academic literature about whether you should have a neutral option or not have a neutral option. This goes back and forth. I prefer a neutral option. It is a preference, and one that I can defend, but one that I could also show you there's a lot of arguments against having a neutral. Look it up, it's a big debate. And if I don't have a neutral, that presumes that you must have an opinion on this. These true falses, right? I have a friend who, amazing at nailing true false questions. Like, you give her just true or false, yes or no. She's like, well, but it could be like this, and it could be like that. She's amazing at this. What if it's only mostly true? Right? It's like the Princess Bride. Your friend is only mostly dead. Oh, there's only one thing you can do. But, right, what if something's only mostly true? Does that mean you should circle true? I've sometimes seen always, sometimes, never. Well, what's sometimes? Once a month, once a year, once in a lifetime. Those are all sometimes, especially when your other alternatives are always and never. Many of you have heard my TEDx talk. You know that I do not like best practices. This is somewhat ironic as a management consultant, because management consultants are all about best practices and all this stuff. And I'm one of those management consultants who is not a fan of best practices. I'm not saying best practices aren't informative. But anybody ever notice that there's a really big problem with best practices? Bias. Successful companies. Is we're looking at all the successful companies, we're determining what they all did, we find the patterns, we figure out what they all did, and then we call that our best practice. How would you feel if I told you that 90% of companies who do the exact same thing fail? You fail, you fall off the radar. We don't know, we don't follow you, we don't track you, we don't know who you are. So all we're doing is we're looking at the survivors. But how would you feel about that best practice if you actually knew how many companies tried it and failed, but you don't? Now, by the way, for all you know, only the companies who did that succeeded. So for all you know, there's a 100% success rate. For all you know, there's a 10% success rate, 1% success rate, and any number in between, or even below 1% success rate. The problem is you don't know. At the same time, does that mean that we just throw out best practices? No. They're informative. Right? Just because best practices are not completely valid, and just because we've got survivorship bias, doesn't mean that we've got survivorship sinking the ship. Our biases don't sink the ship. Right? This is actually one of the big questions, right? People talk about implicit bias. People have implicit bias, yes? Right? Almost everybody has implicit biases. Does that necessarily mean that you're going to act in accordance with your implicit biases? No. In fact, one of the most important questions is what percentage of the time are you going to act in accordance with your implicit biases? Under what conditions will you act in accordance with your implicit biases? Not as often as people think, right? And just because you have implicit biases doesn't mean you're going to use them all the time. As a matter of fact, you might use them very rarely. And most of the tests of implicit bias are looking only at things that you will do in a short amount of time with very little information. As a matter of fact, research shows that once you get a lot more information, implicit biases and the effect of implicit biases tends to fade quite a bit. This raises us a lot of questions. Necessarily why a company is successful. They're just indicators of success. Or they said, we generalize from one data set to another data set. We assume that if it's true about these folks, it's true about these other folks. As a matter of fact, a lot of personality tests or a lot of other tests that are out there, they were tested on very specific sets of people. They don't always have as broad of a range as you think. It's like you see a lot of neurological tests, like some of the neuroscience findings. Very often they test only right-handed people. Me who aren't. Okay, well, you know, we can, maybe we're like the right-handed people, maybe we're not like the right-handed people, you know, who knows, but there's a lot of research still to do. There are reasons to believe that it might be the same, but still, you're testing a lot, in many cases you're testing right-handed people. Okay, how generalizable are your results? Just because you have statistical significance does not mean that it's valid. Doesn't mean your instrument's valid, doesn't mean your theory is valid, it doesn't mean that your items are valid. There are a lot of other validity questions that can totally screw you over as you're trying to solve this understanding. The hypothesis, you run the statistics and you get it wrong, but the results are still meaningful. Just because the tests are not statistically significant, you don't always know which conclusions you draw. Be careful what you act on, how you act on it, what you do about it. Be careful, that's all. Don't jump to too many conclusions. The miss is that a survey is not an experiment. Not experiments, surveys are not experiments, surveys are not experiments. You're not testing, you're not doing a randomized control trial, you're not testing an intervention, you're not comparing a control group and an experimental group. You are assessing the state of the art, or the state of the situation. Right? I mean, for example, one of the things that you see very often is surveys, you know, assessing the differences between the genders, right? Assessing the difference between the guys and the gals, right? And here's the thing, right? Often we are assessing adults, right, who have been socialized in what the nature of a guy is and what the nature of a gal is, right? Can you necessarily attribute it to their sex, as in, you know, whether they've got an XX, an XY, or whatever else, right? Is this a true difference between men and women, or is this an exhibit of the differences in socialization between men and women? Not so simple. Not so simple. We can do surveys, we can ask why, but that only gives us the state of the situation. A survey gives us the state of the situation, but it doesn't necessarily give us the reasons. If only because there's a lot of bias that's been introduced already. But all those subtleties in language, how we frame the question, how we assess the question, all those things, that's a really big difference. Because I'll tell you what happens if we actually took a bunch of young children that were not socialized in any particular way as far as gender goes, and we give them tests of computer programming ability. That might be slightly different, right? That's an experiment, not a survey. But even then, there are a number of limitations to that study. You can't just run it that way. It's a lot more complicated than that. Be careful with how you define them, with how you operationalize them. If you're going to use a word that's fuzzy, it's a good idea to provide a working definition. You use words like creativity, engagement, employee engagement, all these sorts of things, psychic, fun, positive, all the rest of that stuff. It's worth your while to provide a working definition. Make sure we're all on the same page, what we all mean by this. It's definitely possible. And once again, is my final what or is it a why? The overwhelming majority of the time when I see data analyses done, you have found a what, you have not found a why. It's very hard to find a why, and it normally requires a randomized control trial. And generally speaking, this is a good rule of thumb, not a perfect rule of thumb, but a decent rule of thumb. Unless you did a randomized control trial, you almost always found a what, and you've almost never found a why. If it's a survey, you have found a what, you have never found a why. Surveys cannot tell you why. They can only tell you what. Got some good guesses, you've got educated guesses. You might even act on those educated guesses, but respect the fact that you don't actually know. Anyway, the answer. So many times we haven't thought about what we're going to do with the answer. And not for nothing, and again, this was great advice given to me by my professor, was before you even start collecting data, you should know what statistical analyses you're running. You should have that all planned out. You should have that all pretty much coded in. Like the code for how you're going to run the analysis should be prepared before you start collecting data. Doing something wrong, but that also helps you know what you're going to do with the answer and actually guides you on the creation of the data.